If a woman tries to poison her husband, but kills the wrong man, what happens next? Catherine, 23 years old, was supposed to be an ordinary bride, but her wedding night was spent with someone else. The problem, that someone else was her 19-year-old stepson, and they had plans, both of them. Catherine wanted to escape her husband. The stepson, Thomas, we never understood what he wanted. Maybe his father's place, maybe Catherine, maybe both. 8 months later, a baby was born. 2 weeks after that, someone was poisoned, but the man who died was the wrong man. Thomas disappeared. For 3 years, nobody searched. Then he was found in the mansion's basement, chained, skeletal, but there was a strange happiness in his eyes. "She finally found me," he said. "Hocho found him. Catherine? The baby? Or the man who was supposed to be dead?" This story starts with 3 people, but how many people it ends with? Nobody knows. June 12, 1851. Blackwell Manor, Richmond, Virginia. The wedding had been perfect, everything Charleston society expected from the union of Richard Blackwell and Catherine Monroe. White roses imported from England, French champagne that cost more than most families earned in a year. 300 guests dressed in their finest, all pretending they didn't notice the age difference. Richard was 45, Catherine was 23. Nobody asked why she said yes. In Virginia in 1851, women didn't need reasons beyond survival. The reception ended at midnight. Richard had drunk enough champagne to sink a small ship. His business partners carried him to the master bedroom, laughing about wedding night traditions and making jokes. Catherine pretended not to hear. She smiled. She thanked them. She played the blushing bride perfectly. By 1 in the morning, Richard was snoring. Catherine sat in her wedding dress in the chair by the window, looking at the gardens below. The silk felt heavy against her skin. The corset made it hard to breathe. Or maybe that was just fear. She had known what this marriage meant when she accepted Richard's proposal 6 months ago. Her father's debts had made the choice simple. Marry Richard Blackwell and save the family from ruin. Refuse and watch everything collapse. Simple choices, terrible consequences. She was unbuttoning the tiny pearl buttons on her sleeve when she heard the door open behind her. Catherine turned, expecting to see Richard awake, expecting to have to perform her wifely duties while he reeked of alcohol and made clumsy attempts at tenderness. But it wasn't Richard standing in the doorway. It was Thomas, Richard's son from his first marriage, 19 years old, dark hair, dark eyes that looked too old for his face. He stood there in the doorway wearing evening clothes, his cravat loosened, holding a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. Catherine should have screamed, should have told him to leave immediately, should have woken Richard. She did none of these things. "Your father is asleep," she said quietly. Thomas closed the door behind him. The lock clicked. That small sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence. "I know," he said. "I made sure he'd sleep deeply tonight. The champagne I gave him had laudanum in it. He won't wake until morning." Catherine's hands stilled on the buttons. She looked at this boy, this stranger who was now technically her stepson, and felt something shift in the air between them, something dangerous. "Why are you here?" Her voice was steady. That surprised her. Thomas crossed the room, set the wine and glasses on the small table near the window. He poured carefully, precisely, like someone who had practiced this moment in his mind many times. "Because you don't love him." It wasn't a question. Catherine took the glass he offered her. Their fingers touched briefly. His hand was shaking slightly. So he was nervous too. Good. Nervous people made mistakes, and Catherine had learned young that other people's mistakes were opportunities. "Love has nothing to do with marriage," she said. "Surely you know that." "I do." Thomas sat in the chair across from her. "My father married my mother for her family's plantation. She married him to escape her father's house. They tolerated each other for 11 years before she died, giving birth to my sister. A sister who lived for 3 days. Catherine sipped the wine. It was excellent. Rich and dark and probably worth more than her wedding dress. "I'm sorry," she said, because it seemed like the thing to say. "Don't be." Thomas leaned forward. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. This house, this family, this life, it's built on transactions. My father doesn't love you. You don't love him. But there's something else between you now. Something you can use." "Use for what?" Thomas smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. For freedom, for power, for getting what we both want. This is where Catherine should have ended the conversation, should have sent him away, should have maintained the fiction that she was an innocent bride who believed in love and duty and all the lies society told young women to keep them compliant. But Catherine had stopped believing in fairy tales when she was 14 years old, and her father gambled away her mother's inheritance at a Charleston card game. "And what do we both want?" she asked. Thomas set down his wine glass and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You want to escape. I want to matter." The truth hung between them like smoke. Catherine understood in that moment that this boy, this 19-year-old, who should have been nothing more than an awkward stepson, had seen through her completely, had recognized the calculation behind her smiles at the wedding, had noticed the way she looked at Richard with polite distance rather than affection, had understood that she was playing a role just as he had been playing the role of dutiful son. Some people see each other clearly from the first moment. It's not love, it's recognition. Two predators acknowledging they're the same species. "Tell me what you're thinking," Catherine said softly. Thomas stood and walked to her chair. He knelt in front of her, his face level with hers. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My father will expect you to be a wife, to manage his household, to bear his children, to smile at his business partners and pretend you're grateful for the privilege of being Mrs. Richard Blackwell. He'll want you in his bed until you give him an heir, and then he'll probably leave you alone except for formal occasions." "Yes," Catherine said, "I know all this. But what if there was another way?" Thomas's hand touched her knee, tentative, testing. "What if you could have the security of this marriage without the burden of it? What if my father's death could be arranged to look like natural causes? A man of 45, overweight, fond of rich food and excessive drink. Such men often die suddenly. Heart problems, strokes. Nobody would question it." Catherine's heart was beating very fast now. This conversation had turned from dangerous to criminal. She should stop it, should call for help, should remember that this boy was essentially suggesting murder. Instead, she asked, "And what would you get from this arrangement?" Thomas's hand moved higher to her thigh. The wedding dress was layers of silk and petticoat, but she could feel the heat of his palm through the fabric. "You," he said simply, "not as a wife, not publicly, but in the ways that matter. You would be wealthy widow. I would be the grieving son who helps you manage the estate. And at night," his other hand cupped her face, "at night we would have each other." This was insane. This was impossible. This was a 19-year-old boy proposing murder and adultery on her wedding night while his father slept 20 feet away. Catherine knew she should refuse, knew this was a fantasy built by someone too young to understand consequences, but she had been married for 8 hours and already felt like a prisoner. And this boy was offering her a key to a cell she hadn't even fully understood she was locked in. One time she heard herself say, "Tonight. That's all. Then we'll talk about the rest." She didn't believe her own words even as she said them, but they gave her permission to do what she was about to do anyway. Thomas kissed her. It was not gentle. It was not the kiss of a boy. It was hungry and desperate and full of everything he had been holding back. Catherine kissed him back. What happened next took less than an hour. The wedding dress fell to the floor in a whisper of silk. The bed that was supposed to be shared with Richard remained empty. Instead, Catherine and Thomas used the chaise lounge by the window, quick and frantic and completely silent except for breathing. When it was over, Catherine felt like she'd made a deal with something that wouldn't let her go. Thomas held her for a long time afterward, his face buried in her hair, whispering that she was perfect, that this was meant to be, that they would find a way to be together. Catherine said nothing. She was already thinking ahead, already calculating, already wondering if this boy could actually help her, or if he would become a liability she'd need to eliminate. At 4 a.m, Thomas left her room. Catherine cleaned herself carefully, put on a nightgown and climbed into bed beside her sleeping husband. Richard never woke. In the morning, he believed their marriage had been consummated. Catherine let him believe it. Men, she had learned, would believe almost anything if it made them feel powerful. What neither of them knew was that this one night would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy multiple lives and create mysteries that Virginia society would whisper about for decades. But that morning, Catherine just smiled at breakfast and played the happy bride, and Thomas watched her from across the table with eyes that held too many secrets for someone so young. If you think you know where this is going, you're wrong. What happens next isn't about love. It's about obsession. And the difference between those two things is the difference between life and death. Hit that subscribe button because this story is about to go somewhere you won't expect. The weeks after the wedding settled into a routine that looked normal from the outside. Catherine managed Blackwell Manor with efficiency that impressed even Richard's longtime servants. She reorganized the household accounts. She hosted dinner parties for Richard's business associates. She wrote letters to family back in Charleston, describing her new life in careful, cheerful terms that revealed nothing true. At night, she submitted to Richard's advances with the mechanical compliance expected of wives. She made appropriate sounds. She touched him in ways that suggested enthusiasm. She was, in all visible ways, exactly what Richard wanted her to be. But 3 nights a week, when Richard travelled to his shipping offices in Petersburg, Thomas would come to Catherine's sitting room. They would talk for hours. About everything. About nothing. Thomas would tell her about growing up in this house, about his mother's death, about feeling invisible to his father except when Richard needed someone to blame for disappointments. Catherine would tell him about her childhood in Charleston, about watching her father destroy the family fortune, about understanding from age 12 that she would be sold to the highest bidder eventually. Sometimes they touched. Sometimes they didn't. The physical part was almost secondary to this other thing growing between them. This recognition, this shared understanding that they were both playing roles in a world that had written their scripts before they were born. Do you ever feel like you're watching yourself from the outside? Thomas asked one night in August. They were in Catherine's sitting room, curtains drawn, a single candle burning. Like you're an actor in a play you didn't write, Catherine nodded, every day. Sometimes I think if I could just step out of the role, just for a moment, I could figure out who I actually am underneath it all. And who do you think you'd be? Thomas looked at her with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. Someone who matters to you, he said quietly. That's all I want. To be real to at least one person. This should have been a warning sign, this level of need, this desperate desire to be seen. But Catherine was 23 and had her own desperate needs, and she mistook his obsession for devotion. You matter to me, she told him. It was the truth. But it was also the worst thing she could have said, because Thomas heard it as permission, as a promise, as a commitment that went beyond what Catherine actually meant. By September, Catherine had missed 2 monthly courses. She knew what this meant. Knew that a baby was growing inside her. Knew that the timing made it ambiguous whose child it was, Richard's or Thomas's. She told Thomas first. His reaction was not what she expected. She thought he might panic, might suggest ways to end the pregnancy, might realize this made everything infinitely more complicated. Instead, Thomas knelt in front of where she sat and placed both hands on her still flat stomach. Ours, he whispered. This is ours. This proves we're meant to be together. Catherine felt ice slide down her spine. This was wrong. This was dangerous. Thomas wasn't seeing clearly anymore. We don't know whose child it is, she said carefully. The timing. I know it's mine. Thomas's hands pressed harder against her stomach. I can feel it. This child is ours, Catherine, and when my father dies, we'll raise it together. We'll be a real family. Thomas, we need to move faster. He stood suddenly pacing. The original plan was to wait 6 months, make it look like natural causes, but we can't wait that long. You'll start showing. People will notice. We need to do it now. Catherine's mind was racing. This had gotten out of control. Thomas wasn't thinking rationally. He was spinning a fantasy that had no connection to reality. We need to be careful, she said. We need to think this through. I have thought it through. Thomas pulled a small glass vial from his pocket. Arsenic, enough to kill him, but not so much that it's obvious. We'll put it in his evening wine. He drinks alone in his study every night. Nobody will suspect anything. Catherine stared at the vial, at this physical evidence that they had crossed from fantasy into something irrevocable. Where did you get that? I've been planning this since before you married him. Thomas said it like it was obvious, like it was romantic. Since the first time I saw you at the engagement party, I knew then that you were meant to be mine, that my father was just an obstacle we'd have to remove. This was madness. But Catherine was trapped. If she refused now, Thomas might expose everything, might tell Richard about their affair, might destroy her before she had a chance to secure her position. Or worse, she might lose whatever power she had over Thomas. And she was starting to realize that keeping him controlled might be the only thing keeping her safe. When? She asked. Thomas smiled. Tonight. That evening played out with a surreal quality that Catherine would remember for the rest of her life. Richard came home from his offices at 7, as always. He kissed Catherine on the cheek, complimented the dinner she'd arranged, asked about her day with the vague interest of a man who didn't really care about the answer. At 8, Richard's business partner Samuel Whitmore arrived unexpectedly. He needed to discuss an urgent shipping contract. Richard was annoyed but invited him to the study for evening wine and cigars. Thomas had already poisoned the wine decanter. Neither Thomas nor Catherine knew Samuel would be there, knew Richard would share his wine with his business partner. At 9:30, Catherine heard shouting from the study. She ran in with Thomas behind her to find Samuel on the floor, convulsing. Richard was on his knees beside him, calling for help. Samuel Whitmore died in 12 minutes. His face turned purple. His body jerked in ways bodies shouldn't move. He vomited blood on Richard's expensive Persian rug. The doctor was called. He determined that Samuel had suffered a massive stroke, possibly triggered by a heart condition nobody knew he had. These things happened. Vrand. Men died suddenly. It was tragic but not suspicious. Samuel's body was removed, the study was cleaned. Richard spent the night in shock, drinking brandy and talking about how Samuel had been perfectly fine just hours before, how these things made you realize life was fragile, how it could have been him just as easily. Catherine listened and comforted and said appropriate things. Thomas stood in the corner, white-faced, barely breathing. When Richard finally went to bed, Catherine found Thomas in the library. He was shaking. "We killed the wrong man," he whispered. "We killed the wrong man." "It was an accident," like Catherine said quietly. "Nobody knows anything. The doctor said it was natural causes." "But Samuel is dead, and nothing we do will change that, so we stay calm. We act normal, and we never speak of this again." Thomas grabbed her shoulders. His fingers dug in hard enough to bruise. "We can't stop now," he said. "Don't you see? This was a sign. We were meant to try again, to finish what we started." Catherine pulled away from him. "No, this is over, Thomas. What we had, it was a mistake. I'm pregnant, yes. I'll tell Richard the baby is his. You will act like the dutiful stepson, and we will never be alone together again." Thomas's face changed. Something in his eyes went dark and cold. "You can't mean that." "I do. After everything. After what we've done together. After you told me I mattered to you." Catherine felt trapped, felt the walls closing in, felt the weight of her choices crushing her. "You're 19 years old," she said, trying to be gentle. "You'll find someone your own age. You'll have a real life. This was never real, Thomas. It was just a moment, a mistake." She should have known better. Should have understood that you can't tell someone they matter and then take it away. Should have recognized the dangerous obsession growing in him. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he left the room without another word. Catherine thought that was the end of it, thought he would be angry, maybe tell his father, maybe cause a scandal, but eventually move on. She was wrong about everything. What do you do when the person you tried to kill won't stay dead? When the person you thought was in your control turns out to be controlling you? When the baby growing inside you becomes a weapon neither of you expected? If you're still watching, you need to see what happens next. Drop a comment if you've already guessed where this is going. I promise you haven't. The baby was born in May of 1852. A girl. Small and perfect and screaming with life. Richard was overjoyed. He named her Eleanor after his mother. He hired 3 nurses. He had the nursery painted and filled with imported furniture from France. He told everyone who would listen that fatherhood at 46 was a gift he hadn't expected. Catherine held her daughter and felt nothing but cold calculation. This child was her insurance policy, her guarantee of financial security. Richard's heir would inherit everything, and as the mother, Catherine would control that inheritance until Eleanor came of age. Thomas came to visit the baby once. He stood over the cradle for a long time, just staring. "She has your eyes," he said finally. Catherine didn't respond. "Does he know?" Thomas asked. "Does Richard know she might not be his?" "She's his daughter," Catherine said firmly. "That's all anyone needs to know." Thomas turned to look at her. His face was expressionless now. All the emotion, all the desperate need she'd seen in him before, had been replaced with something blank and terrifying. "You're very good at lying," he said quietly. "I should have realized that earlier. You probably never felt anything for me at all, did you? It was all just performance." Catherine wanted to protest, wanted to say that she had cared in her way, that what they'd shared had meant something, even if it couldn't continue. But she was tired of lying, tired of maintaining fictions for other people's comfort. "I did what I had to do," she said simply, "as did you." Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, I suppose we both did." He left the nursery. Catherine didn't see him for the next 2 weeks. Then on June 3rd, 1852, 2 weeks after Eleanor's birth, Thomas invited his father to join him for an evening drink in the study. Richard was pleased. His son rarely sought his company. This felt like progress. They sat in the leather chairs by the fireplace. Thomas poured wine from a new decanter. Not the one that had killed Samuel Whitmore, which had been thrown away months ago, but a fresh one, clean, innocent. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," Thomas said. Richard sipped his wine. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about my future, about what I want to do with my life." Good. You should have ambitions. What are you considering? Law? Business?" Thomas poured more wine into both glasses. His hands were perfectly steady. "Actually, I was thinking about travelling. Perhaps going to Europe for a few years, seeing the world before I settle into adult responsibilities." Richard looked pleased. "That's an excellent idea. Your mother and I travelled to Italy on our honeymoon. It was one of the few good memories we shared. I'll provide you with funds, letters of introduction, whatever you need." "Thank you, Father." They talked for another hour. About travel, about business, about family. It was the longest, most genuine conversation they'd had in years. At 10 o'clock, Richard stood to go to bed. He swayed slightly. Too much wine, he thought. He was getting old, couldn't drink like he used to. "Thomas," he said, gripping the back of the chair for balance, "I'm proud of you. I don't say it enough, but I am." Thomas smiled. "I know, Father." Richard made it halfway up the stairs before his heart stopped. The doctor said it was sudden cardiac arrest, not uncommon in men his age, especially those who indulged in rich food and alcohol. Tragic, but expected given Richard's lifestyle. The funeral was large. Richard had been well respected in Richmond society. Catherine played the grieving widow perfectly. Black silk, dignified tears, appropriate shows of devastation. Thomas played the grieving son. But something in his eyes was wrong, something hollow. At the reading of the will, Catherine learned she had inherited everything. The house, the business, the fortune. Richard had updated his will after Eleanor's birth to ensure his wife and daughter would be provided for. Thomas inherited $5,000 and some minor properties. It was generous by most standards, but it wasn't what Thomas had expected, wasn't what he thought he deserved. Catherine saw him after the lawyer left. They were alone in Richard's study for the first time in months. "I suppose you got what you wanted," Thomas said quietly. "I didn't want this," Catherine lied. "I didn't want Richard dead." "Yes, you did. We both did. The difference is I had the courage to actually do it." Catherine's blood went cold. "What are you talking about?" Thomas laughed. It was an awful sound, empty and bitter. "Did you think I'd just let you dismiss me? Let you pretend what we had meant nothing? I told you I wanted to matter. You didn't listen." "Thomas, I killed him," Thomas said simply. "I poisoned the wine, the same way we tried with Samuel, but this time I made sure the right person drank it. And now you have everything. The house, the money, the baby, everything we planned for." "We didn't plan for anything," Catherine said, her voice shaking. "That was your fantasy, not mine." "Was it?" Thomas stepped closer. "Are you sure? Because I remember very clearly you saying you wanted to escape him, that you wanted freedom, that I mattered to you." "I was lying," Catherine said desperately. "I know." Thomas's smile was terrible. "I know you were lying. But I loved you anyway. I killed for you anyway. And now you're going to have to live with that. Every time you spend his money, every time you sleep in his bed, every time you look at that baby and wonder whose it really is, you'll remember that I did this for you, whether you wanted it or not." Catherine felt panic rising in her throat. You could be hanged for this. If anyone knew, who would believe you? The grieving widow trying to shift blame to the grieving son. No, Catherine, we're bound together now, forever, by what we did, by what I did for us. This was when Catherine realized how badly she'd miscalculated. She'd thought Thomas was a tool she could use and discard. She hadn't understood that he was something far more dangerous, someone who would burn down the world just to make her acknowledge him. "Get out," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "I'm leaving for Europe next week, just as I told Father I would. I'll be gone for a while, maybe a year, maybe more. But I'll come back, Catherine. And when I do, things will be different between us. You'll see." He left. Catherine stood in the study, surrounded by Richard's books and furniture and the ghost of his presence, and wondered what she'd done. She didn't have to wonder for long. Thomas disappeared the next day. His bags were packed, his travel documents were in order, but he never boarded the ship to England. He simply vanished. At first, Catherine thought he'd run away, fled the country under a different name. Good riddance. But as days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months, something started to nag at her. Some instinct that said this wasn't right. Thomas wouldn't just leave. Not after what he'd said. Not after going to such lengths to make her see him. She searched his room, found nothing, questioned the servants. Nobody had seen him since the day of the will reading. 3 months passed, 6 months, a year. Catherine began to breathe easier. Maybe he was dead. Maybe he'd killed himself, consumed by guilt or obsession or whatever twisted emotion had driven him. She convinced herself she was free. She was wrong. "You think you know what happened to Thomas? You think he's dead or gone or hiding somewhere? What if I told you he never left the house at all? What if I told you Catherine knew exactly where he was the whole time? And what if the person who finally found him was the last person anyone would expect?" Keep watching. This story is about to reveal its darkest secret. Eleanor was 3 years old when she found the door. It was June of 1855, 3 years since Richard's death, 3 years since Thomas's disappearance. The house had settled into a new normal. Catherine ran the estate efficiently. Eleanor was being raised by nurses and tutors. Life was calm, predictable, safe. Then Eleanor got lost playing hide-and-seek with her nurse. Blackwell Manor was large, with many rooms that were rarely used. The servants knew which areas were off-limits, which doors stayed locked, which parts of the house Mrs. Blackwell insisted remain private. But 3-year-olds don't respect boundaries. Eleanor found a servant's staircase that led down to the basement storage areas, found a corridor that smelled like damp stone, found a door with a heavy lock. The lock wasn't engaged. Someone had forgotten to secure it that morning. Eleanor pushed the door open and found a room lit by a single candle, found a cot with thin blankets, found a chamber pot and a water bucket, found a man chained to the wall. The man was skeletal. His clothes hung off him like rags. His hair had grown long and matted. His skin was pale from years without sunlight, but his eyes were bright, alert, focused. He looked at the little girl in the doorway and smiled. "Hello, Eleanor," he said. His voice was hoarse from disuse, but gentle. "I've been waiting to meet you." Eleanor should have been scared, should have run away screaming. Instead, she walked into the room and looked at him with curious 3-year-old directness. "Who are you?" "My name is Thomas. I'm your..." He paused. "I'm someone who knew your mother. Are you sick? Is that why you're down here?" Thomas laughed. It was a broken sound. "Yes, I'm sick, but not in the way you think." The nurse found Eleanor 5 minutes later, found her standing in front of Thomas, chattering about her dolls and her pony and her new dress. The nurse screamed. Within minutes, Catherine was there. She stood in the doorway of the basement room, looking at Thomas chained to the wall, looking at her daughter standing too close to him, looking at the secret that had just been exposed. "Take Eleanor upstairs," she said quietly to the nurse. "Now." The nurse grabbed Eleanor and fled. Catherine and Thomas looked at each other for the first time in 3 years. He looked terrible. She had been feeding him, of course, enough to keep him alive, but she'd kept him in darkness, in isolation, chained like an animal. "She finally found me," Thomas said. His voice was raspy but strangely content. "I knew she would eventually. I knew you couldn't keep me hidden forever." Catherine's mind was racing. The nurse had seen. The servants would talk. This would get out. She needed to control the narrative immediately. "Why didn't you call for help?" she asked. "In 3 years you never once screamed for the servants. Never tried to break free when I brought you food. Why?" Thomas looked at her with those dark eyes that had once held desperate need and now held something much more frightening. Acceptance. Peace. "Because this is where I belong," he said simply. "Don't you see? I told you I wanted to matter to you. And I do. I matter so much that you can't let me go, can't let me leave, can't let me exist anywhere but here, where you can control me completely." "You're insane." "Probably." Thomas shifted against his chains, the metal scraped against stone. "But I'm also right. You keep me here because some part of you needs this, needs to know I'm here, needs the power of having me locked away." Catherine felt sick, felt like he was seeing something in her she didn't want to acknowledge. "I kept you here because you're a murderer," she said coldly. "Because you confessed to poisoning Richard. Because letting you go free meant risking exposure." "Then why didn't you kill me?" "It would have been easy. Poison my food, strangle me while I slept, crack my skull and claim I attacked you. Why keep me alive in your basement for 3 years, if not because some part of you wants me here?" Catherine had no answer, because the truth was complicated. The truth was she had planned to kill him, had mixed poison into his food multiple times in the first months, but always stopped at the last moment. She told herself it was because murder was too risky, because a second death would raise suspicions. Because keeping him alive and hidden was safer. But maybe Thomas was right. Maybe some twisted part of her needed him alive, needed to know he was suffering, needed the power of his complete dependence on her. "What happens now?" Thomas asked softly. Catherine thought quickly. The nurse would talk. The story would spread. She needed to get ahead of it. "Now I call the authorities. I tell them I've discovered you hiding in my basement. That you've been living here secretly for 3 years, probably since your father's death. That you must be mentally disturbed. That you need to be institutionalized for your own safety." Thomas smiled. "Will you tell them I killed Richard?" "No," Catherine said slowly, "because that would implicate both of us. Better you're seen as mad than murderous." Very practical. "I've had 3 years to learn to be practical." Thomas leaned his head back against the wall. He looked almost peaceful. "There's one thing you should know," he said. "One thing I've been saving to tell you when this moment came." "What?" "The baby. Eleanor. She's mine." Catherine felt the world tilt. "You can't know that." "I can, because the timing was wrong for Richard. You know it, I know it. You just never wanted to admit it. But I've been down here for 3 years thinking about it, calculating, remembering, and I'm certain." "It doesn't matter," Catherine said, but her voice shook. "It does. Because that little girl who just found me? That's my daughter. And she's going to grow up in this house, surrounded by her father's blood, sleeping above the room where I was kept prisoner, inheriting money that came from the man I murdered. Do you think she'll be okay? Do you think she won't be marked by this?" Catherine wanted to hit him, wanted to scream that he was lying, that he was trying to hurt her, that he had no right to make claims on Eleanor, but part of her wondered if he was telling the truth. "The authorities are coming," she said instead. "You'll be taken to an asylum. You'll never see either of us again." Thomas nodded. "Probably, but I'll know she's out there, that's enough." Catherine turned to leave. "Catherine," Thomas called after her. She stopped but didn't turn around. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for keeping me alive, for visiting me all these years, for making me matter, even if it was just as your prisoner. It was more than I had before." Catherine left without responding, left him chained in the basement, left to tell her story to the authorities. They came within hours, Sheriff Morrison and 2 deputies. They found Thomas exactly where Catherine said he would be. Chained, filthy, clearly disturbed. They questioned him gently. Was he hurt? Why had he hidden here? Did he need help? Thomas answered each question calmly. Yes, he had been living in the basement. No, Mrs. Blackwell didn't know until today. He had hidden after his father's death because he couldn't face the world. He had survived by stealing food from the kitchen at night. The chains, he had put them on himself, to stop himself from leaving, to keep himself safe from his own destructive urges. It was a mad story. But Thomas told it so calmly, with such apparent sincerity that the authorities believed him. He was taken to Virginia State Lunatic Asylum in Williamsburg, committed indefinitely, diagnosed with melancholia and delusional thinking. Catherine breathed easier. The scandal was contained. She was seen as the innocent victim who had unknowingly harboured a disturbed young man in her home. Society gossiped for a few months, then moved on to newer scandals. Life returned to normal, but nothing was actually normal. Nothing could be. Because Eleanor started asking questions, started wanting to visit the sad man in the basement, started having nightmares about chains and darkness, and Catherine started going to the asylum every month, officially to check on her disturbed stepson. Unofficially, she didn't know why she kept going, didn't know what she hoped to find. Thomas was always calm during her visits, medicated but lucid. He would ask about Eleanor, ask about the estate, ask if Catherine was happy. She never answered that last question. On her third visit, he said something that haunted her. I was wrong, you know, about wanting to matter, about thinking if you just saw me, I would be complete. The truth is, I mattered too much. To you, to myself, to this whole terrible story. And now we're both trapped by it. You visit me because you can't let go. And I stay because leaving would mean admitting this was all for nothing. Catherine wanted to argue, wanted to say she visited out of duty, not need, but she kept coming back. Month after month, year after year. Thomas died in 1862, 10 years after Richard's death. Pneumonia. The asylum doctors said he simply stopped fighting it, stopped wanting to live. Catherine was notified. She arranged for his burial in the family plot. Attended the funeral, stood at the grave while they lowered his coffin. Eleanor stood beside her, 13 years old now, old enough to understand some of what had happened, but young enough to still have questions. Did you love him? Eleanor asked quietly. Catherine considered lying, considered saying the appropriate thing. But she was tired. Tired of lies. Tired of maintaining fictions. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know if what we had was love or destruction, or just two desperate people making terrible choices. But he mattered. For better or worse, he mattered. Eleanor took her mother's hand. I think I understand. Catherine looked at her daughter. Looked at this girl who might be Thomas's child, who carried the blood of a murderer, who had been born from a wedding night that started with champagne and ended with poisoned wine. I hope you don't, Catherine said softly. I hope you never understand any of this. But she knew Eleanor would, eventually. Because secrets like these don't stay buried. They seep into the walls, into the blood, into the stories families tell themselves about who they are and where they came from. Blackwell Manor stood for another 40 years before being torn down. The new owners claimed the house had bad energy, that something felt wrong in the basement, that children refused to play in certain rooms. Catherine lived until 1889. She never remarried, never left Virginia, never stopped visiting Thomas's grave. Eleanor inherited everything. She sold it all and moved to Boston, changed her name, created a new life far from the shadows of Blackwell Manor. She never had children. When asked why, she would say she didn't want to pass on certain tendencies, certain darkness that ran in the blood. She died in 1912, wealthy and alone, leaving her fortune to charitable works for the mentally ill. Her will contained one unusual provision, a fund to maintain Thomas Blackwell's grave in perpetuity, to ensure fresh flowers were placed there every month, to guarantee he would never be forgotten. When asked why she cared about maintaining the grave of a disturbed young man who wasn't even related to her by blood, she simply said he mattered to someone once. That should be enough. This story doesn't have a moral. It doesn't have a lesson. It just exists as evidence that sometimes there are no good choices. Only desperate people trying to survive circumstances they didn't create and can't control. Catherine wanted freedom and security. Thomas wanted to be seen. Richard wanted a young wife to make him feel vital. Eleanor wanted to understand her origins. They all got what they wanted, and it destroyed every one of them. The question isn't whether Catherine and Thomas loved each other. The question is whether it matters, whether love or obsession or need or possession or whatever twisted thing they shared, whether that changes anything about the poison and the chains and the 3-year imprisonment. Whether it changes the fact that 2 men died, that a child grew up with a murderer's blood, that a house had to be torn down because the walls themselves seemed haunted by what happened within them. Some people leave marks on the world that can't be erased. Some choices create consequences that ripple forward through generations. Catherine and Thomas were both victims and villains, both trapped and trapping. Both desperate for something they called love, but was really just 2 people using each other to feel less alone. And maybe that's the only truth in this whole terrible story. That loneliness makes monsters of us all. That the need to matter, to be seen, to be remembered, can drive people to acts they never imagined themselves capable of. Thomas spent his last years in an asylum, medicated and quiet, visited monthly by a woman who couldn't explain why she kept coming. Catherine spent her last years in a mansion that felt like a mausoleum, raising a daughter who looked more like Thomas every year, wondering if she'd made the right choices, or if there even were right choices. And Eleanor spent her whole life trying to outrun a story that started before she was born, but would follow her to the grave. If you've made it this far, you understand that some stories don't have happy endings. Some mysteries don't have satisfying solutions. Some people are complicated enough that calling them hero or villain misses the point entirely. What do you think? Was Catherine a victim or a predator? Was Thomas's obsession love or madness? Could any of this have ended differently, or was it doomed from the moment she accepted Richard's proposal? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe if you want more stories that refuse to give you easy answers. Share this with someone who appreciates dark history and complicated truths. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous prisons are the ones we build ourselves. And sometimes the person holding the key is also the one locked inside.